Hello, Facebook, and slightly later, YouTube. Welcome to our live broadcast. You'll notice that my screen looks a little different, and the video is probably kind of lagging a bit. That's because I'm going to try something a little different here today. As part of our video, I want to be able to show you some text that we'll be looking at, and so what I'm actually going to be doing for most of this, or for all of this, is sharing my screen with you so you can see the things that I'm looking at. And that way I'm going to be looking at some things in the Bible, and I thought rather than me just reading them to you, I would actually let you see them for yourself. You'll also notice the background is different. That's because it's Martin Luther King Day, so I am not at the office. I'm actually in my apartment. Casey is out at the moment, and so I'm going to be broadcasting from here and showing you some very interesting things about the Bible that you may not know. Starting with the fact that your Bible, if you open to the table of contents, it probably looks like this. I'm using the New International Version here. That's what I typically preach out of, and it is the most popular Bible after the King James Version among evangelicals. And it's just a very well-known and very well-done translation. And if I open the book list, you will see these 39 Old Testament books here and these 27 New Testament books here. You may be familiar with these, you may not. You may have learned songs to help you memorize these lists of books, but you were probably familiar with these lists. However, if you were to switch over to certain other translations, for instance, the New Revised Standard Version, suddenly the list changes. You have these same 39 Old Testament books, and you have these same 27 New Testament books, but you also suddenly add this list of 18 other books: Tobit, Judith, Greek Esther, Baruch, the Prayer of Azariah, Susanna, Bell and the Dragon. I like that title. That's a fun story, and we'll talk about it in a bit. Maccabees, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees, Prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151, all these different books. And you're probably not familiar with them. And it will probably surprise you to find out that the majority of Christians in the world use Bibles that include most, if not all, of these extra books. The Catholic Bible includes most of them. Some of these books are only used by the Greek Orthodox Church. 1st Esdras, Prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151, and 3rd Maccabees, those are used in the Greek Bible and the Slavonic Bible, and then 2nd Esdras and 4th Maccabees, those are in an appendix just in the Greek Bible. But the majority of these are actually included in the Bibles of the majority of Christians, because the majority of Christians in the world are not evangelical Protestants. The majorities are actually Catholic and Orthodox. So what I want to do today, because I mentioned the Apocrypha that's what these books are called, the Apocrypha, and I mentioned them in my sermon yesterday. And we've also talked about them a little bit in our Bible study class, or our Bible training class on Wednesday night. We're going to talk about them a bit more as we go on. What I wanted to do is give you kind of an introduction, a Protestant evangelical's introduction to the Apocrypha, what they are and why you might care about them. I'm not going to say that you have to care about them, but I think that they are very interesting and they will provide you with some added depth to understand your Bible. So, first off, where did the Apocrypha come from? Well, when the first collection of the Bible that we have of the Old Testament is called the Septuagint. We talked about this before. It was a Greek translation, and it was the King James version of Jesus's day, and so most people use that version. However, it wasn't an official version produced by the priests or the rabbis of the time. It was, in fact, done by a group of scholars in Egypt, Jewish scholars, and they collected a whole bunch of books. There wasn't an official list of what's in and what's out yet, and so they just collected all of the really popular books that they had about their history and their religion, and they put them together. And those books were used by pretty much everyone. It was a whole library of books. It was about in the 100s AD, so over 100 years after the birth of Jesus, that the Jews finally got together and they made the official list of what's in the Bible and what's in the Old Testament and what's not in the Old Testament. And they used some very reasonable principles to guide that decision. They rejected books that they were not originally written in Hebrew, books that clearly were not written by who they claimed they were written by, books whose view of history does not match the other books that were in the Old Testament. And what they ended up with was the list of 39 books that we use today. However, by the time they came up with this list, the Christians had already been using the books that were in the Septuagint for a long time. And so the Christians continued using this bigger list of books, although they also recognized a difference between the authoritative books and then these other books that were helpful. In the 1500s, the Protestants broke off and they started looking at the Bible again, and they decided that they would follow the Jews' decision that these other books were not part of Scripture, that they were not inspired the same way the 39 books of the Old Testament were. However, they didn't actually remove them from the Bibles. They continued to publish them in the Bible as a separate section. In fact, it wasn't until the 1880s that the King James Version began to be published without the apocryphal books in a separate section. So it's only been very recently that we have had the majority of Bibles printed with only 66 books. Now, the Catholic Church, they consider these apocryphal books, they are also called deuterocanonical, which means second canon, kind of like Deuteronomy, which means second law. They consider them a second set of books that are still part of the Bible. The Greek Church considers them a second level of authority, and so most churches that use these books consider them helpful, and they consider them to help us understand the Bible. But I know that the Orthodox churches do not consider them to have the same authority, and I've actually heard both ways on the Catholic Church, so I don't want to speak for them. I'm not sure exactly how they put the apocryphal books in terms of authority of inspiration. But for evangelicals, they are not considered inspired. They're considered human created books. And so the question is, why would we want to read them as evangelicals? Why would we care about them? Well, first of all, let me give you a brief introduction into what's included in the books. Now that you've been just looking at this one little square in your screen, I'm going to actually start using the rest of it a bit more. So here's the Apocrypha, and you'll find a lot of different books in here, and you can tell that the people who wrote these books were writing them, had been reading their Bibles a lot, and they wanted more. They wanted to continue the story. So, for instance, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, these are historical books, and they continue the story of Israel after the end of Nehemiah and Esther. Nehemiah and Esther are the last history books of the Old Testament, but there are some important things that happened in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the most important events happened during the period covered by 1st and 2nd Maccabees. In fact, they tell the story of Hanukkah, and I believe we've talked about that a little bit in previous deleted scenes as well. So you've got some history books in there, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, 3rd Maccabees. And some of these books are additions to existing books that we have. So, for instance, Greek Esther is a version of Esther that has extra chapters, and so someone added chapters later on. There's the Prayer of Azariah, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon. These are all extra chapters that were added to the book of Daniel. So there were other stories that people made up about Daniel, or people wanted to hear more about Daniel, and so they added these extra stories in. They were clearly created after the book of Daniel was created. You've got the same thing with 1st Esdras, which is actually an extended version of the book of Ezra. And then you've got things like the Prayer of Manasseh, which comes off of a story, in Chronicles it says that King Manasseh repented and said a prayer, but it doesn't give us the prayer. And somebody wanted to really hear that prayer, so they wrote it down. They wrote down their own version. Then you've got books that claim to be written by biblical characters, and almost certainly were not, mainly Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah. Jeremiah the prophet, and Baruch was his scribe. And you've got, I'm going to call them kind of short novels, Tobit and Judith. These are novels that are similar to Esther or Ruth, and they just tell a self-contained story, and they're interesting stories. Tobit is about is a love story. A man goes on a quest to get his father's to retrieve his father's gold. His father has been blinded, and on the way he is guided by an angel, and he encounters a woman who is being plagued by a demon. There's a demon that's in love with her, and every time she gets married, he kills her husband. And so the angel helps him defeat the demon and then heal his father, and everybody lives happily ever after. Judith is a story about a Jewish woman who goes out and during a siege and beheads the general of the attacking army and saves the day. And then finally, you got some books that are just you've got some wisdom literature. Sorry, you've got wisdom literature. Wisdom here, that's an abbreviation for the Wisdom of Solomon. It's one of those books that claims to be written by a biblical character. And then you've got Sirach. In different Bibles, this is called Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach. So Jesus, son of Sirach. And those read a lot like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. So what you'll find here is a lot of books that are very similar to things that you have in the Bible. They try and add on to them. They add on to the story, or they add more content, or they talk about things that we really wish, that some people wish the Bible had talked more about. There's some really interesting stories in here. I really like the additions to Daniel. They're not true, but they make Daniel, and they had some exciting things. They're like fan fiction. Susanna here is a story, it's a courtroom drama. So a woman is framed for adultery by two Jewish elders, and Daniel comes in and cross-examines them and proves that they're lying and saves the day. Bel and the Dragon, there's the Bel is an idol, and there's a little Sherlock Holmes story in here where people claim that the idol is eating food at night, and Daniel spreads ashes on the floor to prove that it's actually priests sneaking in and eating the food. And then there's this dragon, or a snake, that people are worshiping, and they think it's immortal, and Daniel kills it by feeding it rice cakes filled with hair and grease, and it just eats and eats until it explodes. And then there's actually a crossover story at the end of Bel and the Dragon, where Daniel is thrown in another lion's den, and God sends an angel to Habakkuk, who lived at the same time in Israel, or in Judah, and picks up Habakkuk and takes him over to Babylon so that he can bring Daniel lunch, which I think is an interesting story. There's some interesting things about Judith, and that story about a woman who saves the Israelites. And I'm not sure, I think that the author is trying to make it clear that this is a fictional story, because the way he sets it up is I don't know who wrote it, but the author sets it up by saying that Israel is being attacked by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria, after they've returned from exile, which is interesting because Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon, and both Babylon and Assyria had been destroyed by the time the Jews came back from exile. So there's no possible way that those facts could coexist, and anybody who reads the Bible would know that. So it's just kind of an interesting quirk of that story. Also, the book of Sirach, it reads like a really sexist version of Proverbs. Clearly, that man had some troubled relationships with his wife and children, and it's an interesting book, and I'm very glad that it's not actually part of the Bible. But you will be hearing from Sirach later on. There's a place in one of my sermons that I am going to be connecting him with some things that Jesus said to show the comparison. So remember Sirach, remember that name. All right, so that's kind of an introduction to the types of books that you find there. Now the question is, why should we care about them? Why should we care about these books that are not in our Bible? And I can think of three reasons. Number one, I think we should care a little bit because out of respect for our brothers and sisters who are not evangelical, and for the fact that they have their own traditions and they have their own very sincere beliefs, and the fact that they think these books are interesting. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them about their authority, but I think we should respect the fact that they hold these books very dearly and they read them during worship and they use them for different things. I think that should matter to us. The second reason, and this is why I referenced them in my sermon yesterday, is because these books were being read by Jews in the lifetime of Jesus. And that means that we can understand Jesus's audience better if we understand these books. We get to kind of read their mail in a way and watch their television, see the stories that they were telling each other. And I'm going to show you, make that point by showing you some of the passages that I referenced in my sermon. In the sermon, I read a prayer from Daniel 9, where Daniel prays and confesses on behalf of the people of Israel, and even though he didn't participate in the things he's confessing. And I mentioned that this was a very common way of praying, and we can tell because it comes up in the Apocrypha a lot. So what I want to do is I want to show you a few of those places. First, we're going to go into the book of Tobit, chapter 3. Tobit is the old man in the story. He has birds poop in his eye, and he goes blind. And so he's very discouraged and depressed, and he wants to die. And so he prays and asks God to kill him. But it's interesting, in the middle of this prayer, you still, even though it's all about his suffering, you still get a confession of national sin. And you'll see this here. It says, "Do not punish me for my sins or for my unwitting offenses, and those that my ancestors committed before you. They sinned against you and disobeyed your commandments. So you gave us over to plunder, exile, and death, to become the talk, the byword, and an object of reproach among all the nations among whom you have dispersed us. And now your many judgments are true in exacting a penalty from me for my sins, for we have not kept your commandments and have not walked in accordance with truth before you." So as this man is suffering, he connects his suffering with the sins of the community, because the Jews at this time were very focused on their national sin, the guilt of the nation, in addition to their individual guilt. And then if you go to the end of the book, chapter 13, you get the other side of the coin, where Tobit prays. This is Tobit again, the same character, praying, and he talks about the restoration that is coming. He says, "O Jerusalem, the holy city, he afflicted you for the deeds of your hands, but will again have mercy on the children of the righteous. Acknowledge the Lord, for he is good, and bless the King of the ages, so that his tent may be rebuilt in you in joy. May he cheer all those within you who are captives, and love all those within you who are distressed, to all generations forever." So again, he's connecting their need for forgiveness, their need for restoration together, to say that when God forgives them, the city will be restored, and they'll be able to get back to doing the work of God and doing what he's called them to do. So we see the same themes in Daniel. We see them also in Tobit. Now if we go to Azariah, Azariah is only one chapter, and it is not, where is the prayer of Azariah? There we go. So, whole chapter, there we go. So this is actually one of the really common themes in the Apocrypha, and we call it the Second Temple period, the period when the Second Temple was built, and when it was there, in between the two testaments, prayers were very important, and written prayers. And so I talked about how they wrote out a version of the prayer of Manasseh. This is the prayer of Azariah, which is the Hebrew name of one of the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In the moment, I can't remember which one. I think it's Shadrach. And so they wrote out a prayer that he says while he's in the fiery furnace. And in the midst of the fiery furnace, he says, You have executed true judgments in all you have brought upon us and upon Jerusalem, the holy city of our ancestors. By a true judgment you have brought all this upon us because of our sins. For we have sinned and broken your law in turning away from you. In all matters we have sinned grievously. We have not obeyed your commandments, and we have not kept them or done what you have commanded us for our own good. So all that you have brought upon us and all that you have done to us, you have done in true judgment. You have handed us over to our enemies, lawless and hateful rebels, and to an unjust king, the most wicked of the world. And now we cannot open our mouths. We, your servants who worship you, have become a shame and a reproach. For your name's sake, do not give us up forever, and do not annul your covenant. Now, these are additions to the book of Daniel, but they were written much later. And so much later, as people are looking at Daniel, they're still resonating with these prayers on behalf of the people. One last one we're going to look at is Baruch, chapter 2. And here, this is again, it's not actually Baruch, but it's someone later writing in his name. And he says here in verse 11, "And now, O Lord God of Israel, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and with signs and wonders and with great power and outstretched arm, and made yourself a name that continues to this day. We have sinned. We have been ungodly. We have done wrong, O Lord our God, against all your ordinances. Let your anger turn away from us, for we are left few in number among the nations where you scattered us. Hear, O Lord, our prayer and our supplication, and for your own sake deliver us, and grant us favor in the sight of those who have carried us into exile, so that all the earth may know that you are the Lord our God, for Israel and his descendants are called by your name." So again, another place where you see the same idea of confession on a national level. Now, what this tells us is that the people who wrote these books that are not scripture, in my opinion, but these people at this time were thinking along the same lines, and they were very concerned with national forgiveness. And that helps to make the point that when Jesus begins preaching forgiveness of sins, his audience is going to be thinking in these terms. They're going to be thinking in terms of national sin. Not to say that he's not forgiving individual sin. Clearly, that's what he's doing. But he's also offering the promise that if he can forgive individual sin, he can forgive national sin. And if he can forgive their national sin, he can restore humanity as a whole. He can repair that relationship and reconcile human beings and God. So that's how you can use the Apocrypha to better understand the New Testament and what Jesus is saying to his audience, because they would have been hearing these things. But there's another very interesting way that the Apocrypha can help us understand the New Testament, and that's because I believe there's extensive evidence that the people who wrote the New Testament had been reading these books because they were in the Bible at the time, and so they would read them alongside the others. And you can tell that they've been reading them because there's these resonances between the two. It doesn't mean that they thought they were true or authoritative, but it does mean that they were reading them at the time, and they were using them to help make their point. So I want to show you a few passages where you see some very common language between the Apocrypha and the New Testament that to me indicates that they were probably reading these books, and they knew that their audience was reading these books when they wrote the New Testament. So we're only going to look in one apocryphal book for this session. We're going to look in the book called Wisdom of Solomon, which is it's a wisdom book similar to Ecclesiastes, or more like Ecclesiastes than Proverbs. And this section, I'm going to read it, and as I'm reading it, I want to see if you can identify where this is very similar to the New Testament. It says, "Let us lie in wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our actions. He reproaches us for sins against the law and accuses us of sins against our training. He professes to have knowledge of God and calls himself a child of the Lord. He became to us a reproof of our thoughts. The very sight of him is a burden to us, because his manner of life is unlike that of others, and his ways are strange. We are considered by him as something base, and he avoids our ways as unclean. He calls the last end of the righteous happy, and boasts that God is his Father. Let us see if his works are true, and let us test what will happen at the end of his life. For if the righteous man is God's child, he will help him and deliver him from the hands of his adversaries. Let us test him with insult and torture, so that we may find out how gentle he is and make a trial of his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected. Thus they reasoned, but they were led astray, for their wickedness blinded them, and they did not know the secret purposes of God, nor hoped for the wages of holiness, nor discerned the prize for blameless souls. Now, does that remind you of anything? Does that sound at all familiar? It should sound familiar because it has a lot in common with the language that is used in the Gospel of Matthew to describe the opposition to Jesus. We go back up here, we see that he is a righteous man who is inconvenient to them. He opposes them for their sins and claims to have knowledge of God, claims to be a child of the Lord. And so they oppose him, and they decide to test him by condemning him to a shameful death, because if he really is the Son of God, then God will protect him, right? Does that sound familiar? I believe the text seems to show that Matthew has this in mind when he tells the story of the crucifixion. Not that he wrote the true story of the crucifixion, but he chose to point out certain things that he knew would resonate with his audience. Matthew wrote to a mainly Jewish audience, and so when he points out that the people who are there are behaving this way, he knows that the audience who's read this book is going to hear that connection, and it's going to hopefully, if they perceive it, it will cut to their heart to realize that in their story, they are the accusers and Jesus is the righteous man. There's a couple other places that I want to show you. The next one is in chapter 7 of Wisdom. I'm going to read you a few verses from here and see if they sound familiar to you. Starting in verse 25. This is talking about wisdom. Wisdom is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her, for she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Although she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. Now, depending on the translation, you may see more of this than others, but in the original language, there's a lot of similarities between the way wisdom is being described here and the way Jesus is described as the Son of God. And there is a strong connection between Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, and the way the Old Testament talks about God's attributes, like his wisdom. So when you see common language in here connected with the way Paul describes Jesus and the way the author of Hebrews describes Jesus, reflection of eternal light, spotless mirror of the working of God, an image of his goodness, these terms sound familiar to us, and they would have sounded familiar to the original audience of those letters when Paul and the author of Hebrews wrote to them. And so they're not using shocking language to people. They're using language they would have understood. The shock is when they apply them to Jesus. There's one final passage that I want to show you, and that's in Wisdom chapter 13. Here's what it says. For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that neither fire nor wind or swift air, they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air or the circle of the stars or turbulent water or the luminaries of heaven were the gods that rule the world. So they were ignorant of God. They didn't perceive him through his works, and instead they began worshiping created things, which will probably sound familiar if you've read the book of Romans, where it says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness from those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse, for they knew God. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. You can see, again, there's a very strong connection in this language. And Paul probably read the Wisdom of Solomon as a student. He was very well read. He may even have had it memorized. We're not sure exactly how much of how many of the books the Jewish Pharisees memorized, but he clearly read it, and you can see the resonances. Now, does that mean that Paul thought that the Wisdom of Solomon was inspired? Not necessarily. It doesn't mean that at all. But it does mean that he had read that book and he adopted some of the language because it's the way people talked and thought at the time. And so there is some value in reading these books because they give us an insight into the world of the authors of the New Testament. And so let me bring it all down to this. The Apocrypha is, in my opinion, I do not believe the Apocrypha is inspired by God. I do believe that it is a very valuable set of documents for understanding the period in which Jesus and the disciples lived and wrote. And I think that's really important because we have a tendency as Christians to focus, to forget the context that these books were written in and to turn them into modern documents, to treat them as if they're talking about the questions we want to ask and the things we're interested in. And that's not accurate, and it's not fair to the text. The Bible is focusing on the questions of its day, and those questions and their answers have immense eternal significance to us today, and we can use that conversation to answer the questions that we're asking today. But if we lose sight of the context they were written in, that's when we get into trouble and we warp the Bible into saying things that it never intended to say. We talked in the sermon yesterday about how the Old Testament doesn't really have a concept of hell. The New Testament does. But when Jesus is talking about forgiveness, he's not necessarily telling people how to get out of hell. Now, that tends to be the way we talk about it because we're heavily influenced by the medieval perspective. And that's when the Reformation began, and that has shaped a lot of how we talk about forgiveness and salvation. That's not what Jesus was talking about first and foremost. That's not the source of the excitement for people who received his forgiveness. It wasn't, yay, I don't have to go to hell and I can do whatever I want now. They were celebrating the fact that they had been restored, that their sins had been taken away, and they were able to participate as part of God's people again. I think it's really important if we want to accurately understand Scripture that we learn more about the context of the passage. Now, I'm not saying that you can't be a good Christian if you don't read the Apocrypha or you don't read extensive literature on all these. I'm not trying to say that. I'm simply trying to say that as Christians, we just need to be careful and remember that the Bible, while it was written for all Christians, it was not written directly to us, and that we're looking at it from a different culture and a different time. And we just need to be cautious about how firmly we insist on our own way in reading the Bible. I hope that makes sense, and that's a good place to land the plane. This Sunday, we're going to be talking about Jesus' habit of feasting and partying when he came to town. He could be relied on to show up at a feast or two. And we're going to talk about why that's important, because it is actually far more important than I really thought it was for most of my life reading the Bible. But it actually is a very important part of what he did. And then we'll be doing some deleted scenes about that next week. So thank you for joining me. I hope that you will physically join us at church on Sunday, and I hope to see you then. Otherwise, I will see you here next week. God bless.